be included then in the state of Pakistan, or for inclusion of Northwest Frontier Province into the Afghan state, going back to the territory, some of the territory that the Afghan state had in the early 19th century. That dialectic between Afghanistan and Pakistan, that tension between the two of them, remains in place down until the present time, and it's often cited as one of the reasons why Pakistan supported the Taliban in the 1990s as a way of diffusing the tensions between the two states. So, to go very briefly, how am I doing on time?
You've got about 6 minutes. Okay,
great. So, different phases of Afghan politics since the 1950s. A period of absolute rule was in place down until 1960, 1963, 1964. During the 50s and the early 60s, there were strong tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The Afghan state has never recognized the border between the two countries, which was drawn up by the British in the 1890s and imposed on Afghanistan at that time. In the 1960s, Afghanistan had a liberalization of the political system, although there were still no political parties allowed. Political parties under the Constitution of 1964 were foreseen to be operating in principle, but the particular legislation that would have enabled them to actually form up never actually was passed before the monarchy was overthrown in 1973. It was overthrown by a cousin of the king, who had been the regent back in the 1950s. And through the 50s and the 60s, 70s, there was rivalry between the king and that particular cousin. The cousin's name was Mohammed Daoud. And Daoud became the president in 1973 in a new republic. He became president and established that new republic with the backing of left-wing officers within the Afghan military who had been formed up by Soviet military aid over the previous decade. In the mid-1970s, Daoud began to have doubts about their loyalty. He began to move closer to the Shah of Iran after Iran began to have large oil revenues after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. And he began moving closer to Egypt as well. And that led the leftists within the Afghan state, within the Afghan state at that time, to fear that Daoud, the president, was going to crack down on them, as the Shah of Iran had been cracking down on any dissidents within Iran. Daoud was overthrown in 1978 in a coup by the communists. Communists in Afghanistan were organized into two sharply hostile factions hostile to one another. That rivalry continued over the following decade. Because of that rivalry, because of the upheaval into which the country was thrown by the radical reforms attempted by the one faction made up especially of Ghilzai Pashtuns, the Soviets intervened at the end of 1979. Soviet occupation lasted from 79 until the beginning of 1989, with support for the Islamicist resistance to Soviet occupation and to communist reforms being funded by Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the United States. Aid funneled through Pakistani intelligence services, with Pakistan's military dictatorship at the time keen to engage the United States in the region so that it would continue to be a Pakistani ally against India in the long-running India-Pakistan conflict.
2 minutes.
Thanks. Soviet occupation came to an end in the late 1980s when Gorbachev finally decided it wasn't worth staying any longer, and he pulled out. One of the enduring Afghan attitudes towards foreign occupation has been to make the country ungovernable, not worth staying within. That's what happened when the British occupied the country twice in the 19th century. It's what happened in the 1980s when the Soviets occupied the country, and one can argue that it's what has happened again in the last decade with the U.S. occupation. U.S. occupation, which Jason will say more about, I think, took place in October and November of 2001 after the September 11th attacks on the United States. Osama bin Laden had been one of the foreign fighters working with the Mujahideen during the 1980s. He left the country after the Soviet occupation ended, returned in 1996 after the Taliban had taken Kabul. Taliban managed to take Kabul with Pakistani support, in particular with the support of the administration of Benazir Bhutto, who was unhappy with the people that had been supported previously by the Pakistani intelligence agencies to fight against the Soviets. And the current insurgency in Afghanistan involves people that were fighting against the Soviets and armed by the Americans in the 1980s. But most of the backers, the regional warlords, provincial governors who were backing Hamid Karzai also come from that same resistance movement against the Soviets in the 1980s. So what we see is the Mujahideen in the 1990s splitting into various factions fighting against one another. To some extent, that's still continuing down to the present time. I'll leave it there. Other speakers will presumably pick up on the more recent history.
Next up is Nikolai, who will talk about Soviet experience in Afghanistan.
My name is Nikolai. I was born and raised in the Soviet Union. I was drafted to serve in the military at the age 18, and I served in Afghanistan at the very end of the last almost year and a half, and I left in 1989 with the last Soviet troops. It's such a big topic, so I can't possibly cover it in 8 or 10 minutes. I'll focus on things that really stand out for me as someone who now lives in Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen and who sees current Canadian involvement in Afghanistan through lens of my experience back then. I have not been in Afghanistan since I left it in 1989, so take whatever I'm saying with a grain of salt, because I'm not. What I know, what's happening on the ground there, it's usually through people who I talk to, who've been to Afghanistan recently, or through media, pretty much the same sources you can use. So, living in Canada, when Canada went to Afghanistan, I was living in Canada, and particularly from 2006, when Canadians started participating in active combat around Kandahar, and the first Canadian casualties started coming to Canada. So this is when I started noticing a lot of similarities between the situation I was in the 1980s and what's happening now. And there are similarities not in terms of what's happening inside Afghanistan, but what was also happening inside Canada. The shift I could see in the Canadian society and the mentality of people around me, the way people were talking about Afghanistan and war in Afghanistan, which was very similar to what I heard in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. So the similarities, you see, when Soviet Union went in Afghanistan, the reasons which were given for invasion were very similar to what was said by United States and NATO, and Canada kind of went along by default. So one of the main reasons was state security of the Soviet Union due to spreading influence of Islamic fundamentalists, particularly after Iranian Revolution in 1979. And the Soviet leadership had a fear that that would go into Central Asian republics of the Soviet Union that had a very large Muslim population. Again, there were other reasons, but I'm not going to go into them due to limited time. Then another reason was given is building peaceful Afghanistan. Basically, Soviet citizens were told, our troops in Afghanistan are to provide a better future for Afghans, to protect them from external intervention. It was kind of double intervention that Soviet Union saw in Afghanistan. One was from, again, influence of Islamic fundamentalists, and the other one was in the context of a Cold War. Soviet Union was afraid that the United States would move its military assets into Afghanistan, and that would threaten its security. So Soviet citizens were told to go in Afghanistan to protect Afghans, to provide them with a better future. Like today, women's rights were widely claimed as reasons for invading, and of course when Soviet media was talking about successes of Soviet policies in Afghanistan, they would show images of women working alongside the men, having equal jobs, schools for girls were open, and when we were talking about resistance, it would always be stressed, but resistance is attacking schools, is attacking women, and that was very similar to what you can hear today in the media. And other reasons were fighting terrorism and Islamic fundamentalism. That was also, I mean, back then all of these reasons, all rhetoric had flavor of the Cold War, and everything was seen in the context of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, two nuclear superpowers. But if you boil down to actual sort of bones, that was very similar to today. So the changes that I notice in Canada, that usually the largely Canadian population, at least from my experience of what I could see around me in the media, people are kind of indifferent or apathetic to those issues unless they are somewhat interested in current political events in the world, or they have family members who are involved in Afghanistan one way or another, whether in the military or as a civilian advisor. And that is also very similar to what was happening in the Soviet Union. There was kind of, in 2006, I could sense in Canada the shift which was happening in the mentality. It was very similar in the Soviet Union, particularly in the late 80s, when there was kind of, I guess, newly found self-awareness. We're not just a country of peacekeepers, but we're also a country that is capable of sending soldiers and doing a good fighting, and we are fighting the righteous war. And that was very troubling to me, because it was very similar to dynamic in totalitarian Soviet Union, and we're supposed to be better here, but it didn't look that way. Like our mentality shifted towards sort of supporting our troops and cheering for whatever we're doing without really examining are we doing the right thing or not. Yeah, slogan support our troops, very similar to Soviets, and recently I hear a lot in statements of Canadian officials, a sort of sentiment which was similar to time when I was in Afghanistan, when Soviets made decision to leave Afghanistan, and I was right there when it happened. The Geneva Accord was concluded, and the Soviet Union officially announced we were leaving. And then the rhetoric sort of shifted from uncompromising fight against terrorists, which we heard in Canada in the very beginning when Canadians went to Kandahar. We were told Canadians are not negotiating with terrorists, we're just going to fight with them. So what we hear now is more, okay, it's up to Afghans to take their own affairs in their own hands. And that was happening in the Soviet Union. Basically, we were saying, we're going to train your army, we're going to give you equipment, resources to fight your own war, but it's up to you. Our mission is completed here. So we did our own fight. And I find it both very curious and troubling in a sense, because whatever way you look at it, we are a foreign army in a foreign country, and we are supposed to take responsibility for whatever we're doing there. What we're doing now, we're kind of saving our face and stepping back and saying, okay, here's the resources, and you deal with situation which we greatly contributed to. And I remember before Soviet pullout, my unit did a lot of training of Afghan soldiers in local militia, pro-government militia, and when I watch TV reports right now,